Hi, my name is Rachel Saunders, and welcome to this episode of the Temporal Hospitality podcast. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe, follow us, like us, ring that bell, and check out the script with the link below. In 1997, the BBC released their seminal series, Nazis, A Warning from History, which detailed the systematic and systemic nature of the National Socialist co-option of the whole of German society, which enabled the slaughter of millions of innocent people. Not one person in that society could escape the burden of guilt placed on the German nation, and to this day, German culture has a deep aversion to the mentality that led to the gas chambers. The 1979 Iranian Revolution swept away a despised and despotic Shahist regime to replace it with a regime rooted in fear, terror, and the stripping of all rights except for the men who controlled the levers of power. Both Iran and Germany have faced indoctrination by regimes which terrorise their societies, with the thread they have in common the removal of women's rights over her appearance, work, and ability to move through society as an equal to men. The stripping of women's rights in the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Hungary ignores these warnings from history at their peril. Banality of evil was a concept coined by Hannah Arendt in Eichmann in Jerusalem to help her understand why a man such as Adolf Eichmann could do the acts he did. Unlike Eichmann, many of the apparatchiks who sat behind desks organising the despotic dehumanization of millions of people escaped any definitive punishment because the Allies realised that to punish them would be to strip the whole nation of its civil service. It meant that in Germany, things like Section 171 of the Legal Code were used to keep homosexual men who had been imprisoned in concentration camps into the 1950s. It meant that the horrific abuses German women suffered during the Soviet advance on Berlin were never catalogued or punished. The result is a historic amnesia about the abuses suffered by women and gay men, an entrenchment of a narrative which held that it was only the real Nazis who were guilty of such abuses. This sense of realness and actualness are coming back to bite the modern conceptions of who and who is not a fascist, or using fascistic techniques to oppress minorities. Real fascism in the 1930s came in many flavours. Originating in Italy in the 1920s, it was a reaction against perceived weaknesses in socialist government policy, especially the lack of desire to claim territories that fascists claimed as Italian soil. It morphed into an organisation run by Mussolini, which prompted a strident form of Italian exceptionalism and imperialism, while torturing and sidelining anyone who disagreed with them. German fascism took key lessons from the Italians, though drew deeply from the grievance politics which sprung out of the German defeat in 1918 and the anarchistic quasi-civil war in 1919, which left the stabbed-in-the-back myth intact. German fascism also drew from the deeply conservative conception of society prevalent in Bavaria and Austria, which rooted society as a masculine construct where women were for breeding, hearth, and home. Spanish and Hungarian fascism emerged after 1933 as reactions against pluralistic socialism, seeking to entrench conservative values which placed religious values at the heart of society, while Italian and German fascism has a more ambivalent relationship with the organised church. The entrenchment of anti-women policies was felt in every country where fascism took root. In Germany, the first victims of Nazi fascism were its political enemies, socialists and religious figures, who pushed back from the pulpit. Jews, gypsies, homosexuals and disabled people quickly followed. Yet, in its drive for racial purity, the National Socialists' most pernicious erasure was the emerging women's rights movement. All women were victims of the eradication of women from the workplace and the drive for breeding the next generation of the Deutschen Volk. This is exemplified by the Gold Mother's Cross, introduced in 1938 by National Socialist edict for women who had 8 or more children, with a silver version for 6 or 7. The first crosses were presented in 1938 and the last in 1944, by which time approximately 4.7 million had been awarded. These women were lauded for being broodmares, exemplars of a racist ideology that sought to eradicate anyone not deemed pure enough. In stripping back women to the cradle, the National Socialists bound women over to the mercies of the men in their lives, the needs of the state, and the inherent dangers of repetitive pregnancies on a woman's body. The National Socialists also restricted abortion access to only non-Aryans, with heavy punishment for any Aryan woman who aborted her fetus. To be a woman under 1930s fascism was to lead a circumscribed life based on ideology and creed. Yet, women such as Sophie Scholl find their voice to resist. Across occupied Europe, women found the strength to stand up to fascist brutality, often, like Scholl, at the cost of their own lives. From Paris to Warsaw, women carried out resistant work alongside their male comrades, scouting, assassinations, guides for downed pilots, and then, when the need arose, taking up arms to fight back. Fascism's banality could not erase the spirit of Europe's women, only cow those who were afraid to lose everything because they did not want their privilege to disappear. This warning from history needs heeding urgently, as women's rights are globally being wronged back. It is also a lesson for rights activists and freedom fighters that all rights movements need women to succeed. Christopher Clark laid out that the revolutionary movements which convulsed Europe in 1848 were rooted in a men's world, where working-class women who agitated and did much of the legwork were shunted out of any actual decision-making. The Germanic subjugation of women and a reverence for a past conception of nature drew in part from Goethe's writing, including Goethe's observation that man experiences a tremendous compulsion to bring what he finds under his control, though only grows through a mutual interaction with nature. Much as the Christian Church justified its subjugation of women based on an original sin, fascists in turn drew from a perceived state of nature where women were subservient to men. One of the first institutions the National Socialists attacked was the Institute for Sexology run by Magnus Hirschfeld. While he is most famous for his pioneering work advocating for decriminalization of homosexuality and early trans healthcare, what infuriated the National Socialists the most was his Jewishness, his homosexuality, and his sex education. As Ralph Dozer outlines, Hirschfeld helped educate a wide variety of men and women in Berlin on sexual and reproductive health, providing Weimar Germans with advice which would be unavailable under the Third Reich. Roles within society. How society delineates and understands the roles within it is important for the mediation between the objects in the world and subjective experiences we each had, which, as Berg and Luckman highlight, help us analyse the social roots of ideology. National Socialism grew out of a desire to stop the liberalisation of German society, which under the Weimar Republic was pluralising and embracing new identities. Unlike Bismarck's post-1871 Kulturkampf, the reactionary conservative National Socialist model sought to create a cultural hegemony across Germany. The roles the Third Reich envisioned for women was reductive, not only because it sought to frame women as solely mothers, but also because the specific roles was antiquated in an industrial society that had seen so many men slaughtered during the Great War. Much of this can be seen in the reaction against feminism in the wake of the Vietnam War, where American conservatives used fear of the draft to prevent the enactment of the Equal Rights Amendment. When woman is seen as a refuge against the horrors of war, it dehumanizes women, sees the role of women beneath the citizen sacrifice called of men. Equal rights for women invariably include the sharing of burden of blood and sacrifice, an acknowledgement that women are not simply precious flowers to press into the book of house and home. The Hamas attack on Israel in 2023 brought home the Israeli use of women in their military, with female soldiers sexually abused, kidnapped and murdered alongside their male colleagues. Dead women are a culturally shocking sight, whereas dead men are taken as a given in war. Projecting a sense of cultural innocence onto womanhood as the role we expect women to play is a deeply bourgeois concept, as working class women have long been forced into manual labour, farm work and service alongside their role as mother and housekeeper. Our framing of women in cultural memory is shaped through a media and literary tradition which placed womanhood on a pedestal. To be an ideal woman is to be a doll onto which others project their sense of what you ought to be rather than what you wish to be. Every dead female soldier is a reminder that the artifice of womanhood is cultural, that the roles we expect everyone to follow are rooted in the ideologies we construct. It is easy to argue for womanhood to be this or that, to seek to smash patriarchal traditions or to react against feminist demagogues. What is harder is teasing apart the ideological scaffolding which has led us here. There are many warnings which we can draw from the Third Reich, the most pressing being never again, along with first they came and then we said no. The deeper lessons of not enabling structural fascism to take root appear conceptually easy, yet these require critical engagement to prevent. Simply allowing female soldiers to die on the front line for the nation is not a liberalising force, a point driven home in Starship Troopers where the fascistic government recruits everyone irrespective of sex. Fascism is rooted in state-mandated use of force against enemies, foreign and domestic, so a dead woman is simply another foot soldier following orders. The key lesson, then, is asking what roles ought society allow women to fill, and why do we want women to fill these roles? On the surface, equity suggests every woman fulfills every role in society from head of state through to military grunt, through to business CEO. I think a better question would be, what roles does society think men ought to do? The antonym of allowing women to bleed and die is opening up housework, nursery training and domestic cleaning services to men. It is the traditional women's work which frames the disparity of social roles better, as if a man is unwilling to do these types of jobs, then there is no real equity in society. This is second wave feminism in a nutshell, a critical point in the rush to open up the professions to all women. As Camus points out, the law can reign in fact, insofar as it is the law of universal reason, but it never is, and it loses its justification if man is not naturally good. A day comes when ideology conflicts with psychology, then there is no legitimate power. Thus, the law evolves to the point of becoming confused with the legislature and with a new form of arbitrariness. If we reason that women's work is universally beneath men, then the moment we reason that it is not the case, the ideology we have created conflicts with the psychology of all women. The Third Reich legislated to remove undesirables from the national fabric, in turn reducing women to historic tropes which served a militant purpose in breeding the next generation. This also reduced men down to the parts rendered in service to industry and Lebensraum, blood to be spilt to achieve ideological ends. In this rendering, men were stripped of empathy, compassion and nurturing, made killing machines. Women's work required all of those, plus an acceptance of a lesser state, so to do women's work was to accept a lesser ideological conception of self. Thus, to enforce the strict boundaries between men and women, the arbitrary National Socialist legal system unmade men to shape them as killers. The distance of time has not diminished the riddles inherent in the Third Reich's ideology, as the crimes planned and carried out were so monstrous as to be beyond human comprehension. As Richard Plant points out, the imprisonment of concentration camp inmates continued until at least 1948, with some homosexuals as they were viewed as criminals and not victims. National Socialists turned gay men into Untermenschen for their perceived perversion, which in part was drawn from the notion that those who bottomed were acting as women and thus worthy of dehumanization. The deconstruction of womanhood therefore impacts all men who could not or would not act in a heteronormative masculine manner. Understanding woman as ideologically inferior tore apart gay men and queer culture. Failed lessons. Refracting modern problems back to the National Socialists and fascism is a tired internet trope if it is badly handled and misunderstood. There is plenty of content drawing a direct line between the Third Reich and various current issues, especially with respect to immigration and segregation. Those do have merit, yet it is the lesser obvious warnings which have long gone unexplored, such as the social construction of womanhood. History is not a mirror to darkly gaze into and pluck out obscure references to buttress a point, or, rather, it ought not to be. On the one hand, You walk into any bookshop and odds are the history section will be stocked with Second World War material, often focusing on the Reich. This section of books usually perpetuates a certain narrative which can be hard to cut through, the most pressing one being that there is a warning to be heeded from this period of history. What you rarely see are books on Japan's imperial butchery from the 1933 to 1945, British imperial authoritarianism, American Jim Crow segregation policies, Dutch colonial barbarity, or Belgian treatment of the Congo during the same period. The reason why we focus so heavily on Germany is because how the Third Reich constructed their society and the roles within it. Yes, the conservative ideologies and principles in every country allowed for some barbarous acts, but even the extreme social engineering of the Soviet Union did not render down women to broodmares and their men walking dead. However, the singular lesson we have failed to learn is that the ideological slide into barbarity is not a single step over the line. It is a graduation from equity to erasure. Britain, Japan, and the Soviet Union, along with the Dutch and every other colonial power, used dehumanizing to justify their colonial practices. Jim Crow policies in the American military and Deep South were justified by seeing African Americans as lesser than their white peers. Every society uses ideology to justify its exclusionary policies, ranging from immigration to religion to race to sex, in order to segregate and deny rights to certain people. It is people in that society that uphold these ideological principles, including enforcing exclusionary and dehumanizing principles. It is this that is lost in the rush to paint the history section red, black, and white. Another key lesson lost in the rush to lionize the Allied victories over the Third Reich is the fragile nature of alliances and the politics required to keep grand alliances together. Even in 1944, Churchill recognized the risks of allowing the Soviets to have their sphere of influence. What is less recognized is a willingness to allow the US to reshape the global political order for the sake of arms and monetary underpinning of the Allied cause. The US was inherently anti-colonial, though made no pushback in West Germany to the conservative mindset which kept gay men in prison and women from getting redress for the abuses they suffered at the hands of Soviet soldiers. Removing the National Socialist did not remove the inherently conservative mindset across Europe, as every country liberated in Western Europe saw conservative elements come into power as reaction against socialist and communist parties. Women and every minority who suffered under the Third Reich gained little redress in the liberations. It took second-wave feminism emerging in the 1960s to push back against those conservative principles. This is a true warning from history. It took over 30 years for women and minorities to begin to claw back their rights from the dark days of the 1930s, and even then, those victories were only partial. I can point to the revanchist anti-women bills being passed across the United States. The piecemeal destruction of disability support in the UK relied on many female carers, and the return to natalist principles globally as birth rates plummet. A world that is increasingly hostile to women has amnesia to the depravity waged on women and minorities in the Third Reich.